Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for preachers, teachers, and all Bible-loving creatures. I'm Tim McNinch.
And I'm Rosie Candathol. The amazing Dr. Rachel Wren is off this week. The first reading for February 6, 2022 is Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 8, and possibly a little bit more. We'll say more about that. And this week, we have a special guest scholar with us to help us think through this text.
That's right. We're grateful to have in our Zoom studio Dr. Ethan Schwartz, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible at Villanova University. His research focuses on the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible, so today's passage is right in his wheelhouse. Ethan loves to bring biblical studies into productive conversation with contemporary religious life in synagogues, institutes, and churches. If you're interested in more of his work, we'd recommend that you find him over at the Political Theology Network on the blog called Politics of Scripture. You can find that at politicaltheology.com, and we'll put a link to that on our website. Ethan's career has reached a new high today in being the first guest to appear twice on First Reading. So, Dr. Ethan Schwartz, welcome back to First Reading.
Thank you. It's really great to be back, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it's really good to have you with us, and since your former appearance was before my time at First Reading, it's really great to meet you. So I know you've been teaching for a while now as a Jewish scholar at a Catholic university. Would you mind just saying a word about how you experience that interfaith engagement, or how that's important to you? I'm sure a few of our listeners might wonder why you'd be interested in being a guest on a podcast that follows a Christian lectionary.
Yeah, well, I'm a Jewish scholar who teaches at a Catholic university commenting on a Protestant lectionary in this case. So we've got a lot of bases covered here. What's interesting about my position at Villanova is that it's actually a biblical studies job. I was hired for a job to teach Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. So that is my primary focus there. But because I happen to be a Jew in a Catholic environment, I naturally take on some of those Jewish Catholic dialogue roles, which is something I'm very passionate about. So it's actually it's a perk of this position as far as I'm concerned, even though it's not the main focus. So I try to bring that aspect kind of in as an organic component of the biblical studies part. So using biblical studies as kind of an opening to thinking about Jewish Christian dialogue as a whole, but also Jewish Catholic dialogue in particular.
Absolutely. One more sort of like introductory question here before we dive into our passage for the week. Could you say just a little bit about what draws you to the prophetic literature in particular in the Bible? Because I have to say, for me personally, I find that the prophetic literature is the part of the canon that's the most difficult for me to access and to wrap my mind around. What is it that grabs you about it?
I've always been fascinated by the way, and we'll probably get a chance to talk about this today, but I've always been fascinated by the way that the language of prophecy is used in connection with social critique in contemporary religious contexts, and that has ended up being what I focus on. I'm interested in the way that social critique is configured by this literature as being a role that prophets play, how it aligns with what we expect from modern context, how it does not align in some cases, and the ways that these figures are presented as being in a complex and fraught relationship with authority in a way that feels kind of perpetually relevant and very current. So that would be a little bit of my pitch about how I came to really appreciate.
All right, you've got me sold. I think I could be convinced to appreciate the prophets. All right.
And I was just thinking you've whetted our appetite to get right into this text, right? So, Ethan, would you mind doing the reading for us from Isaiah 6?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to read it here from the New Jewish Publication Society translation. And I will go ahead and read through the end of the chapter, including the optional section from the lectionary, verses 9 to 13.
Thank you.
In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with two he would fly. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, his presence fills all the earth. The doorposts would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. I cried, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my own eyes have beheld the King, Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew over to me with a live coal, which he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched it to my lips and declared, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart and your sin be purged away. Then I heard the voice of my Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here am I. Send me. So that's where the first part of the lection ends, and the rest of the chapter reads as follows. And he said, Go, say to that people, Hear indeed, but do not understand. See indeed, but do not grasp. Dull that people's mind, stop its ears and seal its eyes, lest, seeing with its eyes and hearing with its ears, it also grasp with its mind and repent and save itself. I asked, How long, my Lord? And he replied, Till towns lie waste without inhabitants and houses without people, and the ground lies waste and desolate. For the Lord will banish the population, and deserted sites are many in the midst of the land. But while a tenth part yet remains in it, it shall repent. It shall be ravaged like the terebinth and the oak, of which stumps are left even when they are felled. Its stump shall be a holy seed.
Wow, what a provocative text. And I was struck as you were reading it, just how visual it is. There's so much amazing imagery in here. But I think just to dive into it, maybe we can jump back to the beginning. And we've got that note of historical context. And I wonder what we might say about that. Verse 1 places us in the year of the death of King Uzziah. What's the significance of that marker? What do we know about how this vision, experience, or whatever it is set here?
The opening of the book of Isaiah, the very first verse, tells us that Isaiah's prophetic career overlapped with four kings of Judah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. The notice that this vision corresponds with the death of a king might lead you to expect that this is a change in regime, that this is a moment of royal transition. Actually, it turns out that the dynasty got a little bit messy here because Uzziah was sick for much of the end of his life, and basically his son Jotham was ruling in sort of a regency type arrangement.
That's right.
So what's actually significant about this moment is the broader geopolitical context at the time. Less about the sort of royal chain. Mm-hmm. This is happening shortly before an event that Bible scholars refer to as the Syro-Ephraimite crisis or the Syro-Ephraimite War, which happened in the mid-730s BCE. And basically the situation here, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is sort of the first real world empire, is encroaching on this region. You've got the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah with all the tensions there, the tensions that they have with the larger Neo-Assyrian force, which is threatening them, and then also these other local kingdoms, right, non-Israelite kingdoms. Right. So basically, this region is like a total powder keg. The Middle East being a powder keg.
Yeah.
Who could imagine, right? And what happens in the mid-730s is that basically the northern kingdom of Israel, so just as a reminder for at least the next couple of minutes when we're talking about this context, when I say Israel, I don't mean the people as a whole, I mean specifically the northern political entity, right? In contrast to Judah. So just to be totally explicit there. So the northern kingdom of Israel and a local non-Israelite kingdom, the kingdom of Syria, not Assyria, right? Just Syria, also known as Aram, right? Which is sort of right next door. They basically decide they're going to team up to resist the Neo-Assyrian encroachment, the imperial encroachment. And Judah is not on board with that plan. Mm-hmm. So what this leads to, there's a war between Judah and this alliance between Israel and Syria/Aram. Mm-hmm. All of this, in one way or another, leads to the Neo-Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, which will happen a little over a decade later. The exile of the 10 northern tribes into Neo-Assyria, from which they will never return, and the complete subjugation of the southern kingdom of Judah as a vassal state to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Mm-hmm. So this really represents the entrance of empire squarely onto the stage of biblical history, which is going to be the case for the rest of time, right? From Neo-Assyria to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, to Persia, to Alexander, all the way up to Rome. I mean, obviously we're post-biblical, or for the Hebrew Bible, post-Hebrew Bible at this point, all the way up to Rome and the second exile of the Jews under the Roman Empire. It's just this cycle of imperial domination. Mm-hmm. And it really, this is a key moment in the initiation of that.
Yeah, so how does all of that big political context weigh upon this moment of Uzziah's death?
It's using this as a historical marker. The significance of this death is that it's shortly before the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. That's really the interest.
So hearers or readers of this passage in context would know that that's what's coming up, is this big crisis. That's the sort of context for this experience that Isaiah reports.
Yeah, and that's narrated pretty explicitly. Isaiah chapters 6 to 9 are explicitly situated against that backdrop, right? It's not by implication. It's not by, there's no, it's not a wink. It's it's there. It says it quite clearly.
Well, so you've painted this tapestry, this web that's going on in the background here for this opening speech or opening kind of narration or setting that we're for Isaiah 6. Would you be able to draw any kind of parallel to a modern or close to modern historical example of what's going on here in this text?
I can't think of a specific example, but something from, March 2020, before, when COVID was, we knew it was there, but hadn't really arrived yet. Right. This vision is being situated kind of with the knowledge of this coming event that is just going to totally reshuffle everyone's kind of reality. That's the sense. So you could really map it onto all kinds of major historical events in different parts of the world.
In the last moments of the before times.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful too for anybody that's trying to figure out, how are you going to approach this text, to think about, we've seen things like this before. So the way that Isaiah is framing this passage, that is really helpful to me too, to think about.
Well, maybe we can unpack some of the imagery we find in these first few verses here. Gosh, we've got so much there. It's all packed in there. You've got this throne on which the Lord is seated, and there's these seraphs with way too many wings and using them in various strange ways. What's Isaiah seeing here, and what do we make of it?
Yeah, well, let's start big picture with genre, because that's really important here before we get into this image, because genre is really the name of the game with starting to understand this passage, in my opinion. So this is a call vision. This is a prophetic commissioning. That might seem obvious, but it's actually really crucial that we get that framework in place, because this vision coheres with other prophetic commissioning narratives that are preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3-4, Jeremiah's opening vision at the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, Ezekiel's opening vision in the first 3 chapters of the book of Ezekiel, Gideon in the book of Judges. There are many examples of this genre. So this is a recognizable form that employs a lot of tropes.
So what are some of the big picture elements that we should look for if we're reading this in that pattern?
So we're seeing a kind of fascinating yet terrifying visual appearance of the deity, accompanied by some form of other divine beings. We'll get to the seraphs that we see here. Some sort of concern in response to this on the part of the prophet. And then crucially often, that concern leading to an attempted rejection of the commissioning which of course we do not find here in Isaiah, and we'll get there because the way in which this text actually subverts that trope in the genre is crucial, I think, to understanding the message of this. So that's a good example of how, like, if you didn't have this broader understanding that, like, you know, Moses at the burning bush really tries to weasel his way out of this mission, right? Jeremiah, right? This, if you didn't have that broader understanding, it wouldn't be so striking that Isaiah eagerly volunteers.
Right. You're sort of waiting for him to say, send somebody else, and then you get this twist. Send me. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And it's only a twist if you have the broader genre in your head. So that's why that question of the form is really important. So with that kind of framework in place, then definitely let's talk a little bit more about some of the specific imagery because as Tim noted, this is a very visually striking and saturated text, right? It's all about the visual. Let's start with the fact that Isaiah is reporting this. He is narrating this. It's a past event, right? He's saying, in the year that this happened, I saw this thing, right? And you can almost imagine him like gathering people around and being like, check this out, right? Like, I saw this crazy thing. And what's interesting is that the whole thing then is framed as we are not seeing this, right? We're hearing Isaiah's report. Contrast that with Moses, right? In the story of Moses and the burning bush, then of course the narrator, the anonymous narrator of Exodus is telling us this event. But
we're there with Moses. Yeah.
Right.
right, exactly. We're there with him. Moses isn't narrating it. So what's interesting is that we are kind of 1 degree removed from this theophany, this appearance of the deity, in a way that's not the case with a third-person narrated event like Moses and the burning bush. And yet, the imagery here is so saturated and specific that it really makes you forget that. You really feel like you're standing there with Isaiah and seeing exactly what he's seeing. Another interesting contrast here is looking at Ezekiel chapters 1-3, which is where we get this incredibly detailed description of the cherubs and the divine chariot, which is also incredibly visual. But almost everything Ezekiel says there is qualified by saying it sort of looked like XYZ, or it kind of had the appearance of. So is Ezekiel seeing whatever he's seeing very clearly, but he has no idea how to describe it.
It's more impressionistic.
Exactly. I think that's a great word to describe it. So different here in Isaiah. Isaiah is able to really clearly describe every aspect of what he's seeing.
Yeah, so one thing I wonder about this early description here is just the scale of it. Because I'm trying to, picture with Isaiah what he's seeing there. And the Lord is seated on a throne that's like way up somewhere high. But he's got this robe that fills up the whole space of the temple. So I would to imagine sort of like a larger than life sort of deity here. Is that kind of what he's seeing, do you think?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important. We need to talk about the spatial location here, right? It says there's a throne and there's a temple. This seems to be some sort of heavenly temple, not this specific building in Jerusalem. It's some sort of heavenly palace. So we are talking about something that is otherworldly and on an absolutely massive scale. It's like in The Force Awakens, when you first see Snoke,
right?
He's huge and he's sitting and it looks ridiculous. He's like this huge thing and like what's going on? Like that's kind of what's going on here. Like Isaiah standing before this supersized person.
I think that might be the headline.
Right?
Ethan Schwartz compares the Lord to Snoke.
Look, I'm not gonna lie. When I first saw that scene, this is the first thing I thought of. I was like, the skirts of his robe filling the palace. Like this is what that looks like right there. I liked very little about that movie, frankly, but I enjoyed that connection in my head. So anyway,
what else is in this otherworldly sort of scene here? Then we should talk about the seraphs, right?
Yeah, for sure. So the seraphs are clearly some sort of divine being, but it's very hard to say exactly what they are. So a classic scholarly interpretation of them is that they are some sort of flying snake, some sort of serpent. it's possible that legs is a euphemism for genitals, and that is actually why they're being covered. They're very modest. But because like you could picture like, oh, like we understand why they want to cover their faces. Divine beings often want to conceal their faces. We see this all over the Bible. It's less clear why they would want to cover their legs. But if their legs are actually their genitals, then like the face, that's like another sensitive body part, right? So, and then they've got these two wings left to fly, right? But if they are indeed real legs, then basically this doesn't really sound like any snake I've ever seen. I don't know about you. So,
I hope not.
So I don't really know what these things were meant to look like in the form in which we know it. And you might say, oh, well, if we know that there is this analogy with Egyptian sources, why would they use the word seraph if they didn't mean that? Well, I would point out that in Renaissance art, we call the little flying babies cherubs, even though that's not what cherubs look like even remotely in the Bible, right? Just because they're using the word doesn't mean that they were actually imagining the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good recommendation, just sort of general preaching point for folks out there. We learn in seminary about how to do these fancy word studies and all of that, but it's a real temptation to sort of take those and run with it as if that's the heart of what's going on in a passage. And often, as seems like the case here, you more just sort of have to take the text as it comes and not make too big a deal out of some sort of tangential etymological possibility there.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that if you are tempted to craft a sermon that is entirely dependent on like a specific visual account of what these things look like, it's hanging a lot on things that are quite speculative. That's what I would say. What's more important is that we have some sort of fantastic divine being here. That's not up for debate. And that, I think, is like really what this text wants us to see. That what Isaiah is seeing is nuts, whatever it is.
But also, what are they saying, right? So let's start moving toward verse 3, if we could. Like, holy, holy, holy. Could you fill that out for our listeners? Like, what are they trying to say to one another in this call and response?
So it's important to note they're being situated as basically being attendants, right? They are standing at attendance. They are this kind of entourage for the king, the divine king. And they seem to be uttering this in praise of the divine king. And appropriately enough, the so-called trisagion, this triplicate use of the word holy, kadosh, ends up becoming very liturgically important for both Jews and Christians. And so a big question there is like, what's going on with the threefold use? So there's a few ways. It could be a superlative. Saying holy, holy, holy means the most holy thing we can conceive of, right? Holier than the holiest holy thing, right? Basically. So that's one option. It might be the case that rather than being a superlative, 3 is seen as some sort of number of completeness, right? 3 is like is a special. It's one of those special numbers, like 7. They like 3s, so it might be some sort of statement of perfection.
Completely holy.
Yeah, exactly. If you're a Christian reader of this, it's pretty obvious like where you would take this. It's an allusion to the Trinity. And I want to mention one reading which a teacher of mine, Professor Simeon Chevelle at the University of Chicago, shared with me, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and I've really bought it, which is that it's not actually 3 discrete, specific pronouncements of the word holy, that this is the author's attempt to capture the phenomenon of an echo. That actually what's happening is they are just unendingly saying holy, and the word holy, much like the smoke and the skirts of the robe, is filling the temple. So it's like, wow. Holy, 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 holy. Yeah. So that this is like, and if you think about how would you try to simulate echo in a written text, this is the direction
like
you would
That's
go in.
Really picturesque. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think that there's any rock solid answer here. For obvious reasons, I am disinclined, though, to think that it is the Trinity. That one I will rule out. But the echo language, I think, fits so nicely with the lushness, the kind of sensory overload feel of this passage. I really think that's and the language of filling, right? Because echo you can think of as like a sound filling something.
So if you could comment on the difference between the JPS translation and the NRSV for the whole earth is full of his glory in the NRSV. or his presence fills all the earth.
In terms of the phrase about the presence / glory filling the whole world, so the Hebrew word here is kavod, right? Which is a really important and really difficult word to translate that describes some aspect of God's physical existence, right? Contrary to where Judaism and Christianity would both end up eventually, the Bible, most biblical texts seem to think that God had a physical body, which is often described with this Hebrew word kavod, which comes from the root kaved, meaning weight or heaviness. It's often translated as glory, but the problem with that word in English is that it's a little too abstract. The so-called glory, the kavod, could refer to God's physical body, which in some texts it does, or it could refer to this kind of radiant light with which God's body was illuminated. So those two readings, it's not actually so much an either or, they're connected, the body and the light. So I'm less interested in the translation of presence versus glory, which I just think is two different common ways of translating kavod. What I think is more interesting is that, I'm going to try to explain this without getting too much into the Hebrew grammar here, because I know that not all listeners necessarily know Hebrew, but this phrase could plausibly be translated, the fullness of the earth is his glory or is his presence, right? So not a verbal sentence in which the kavod is filling up the earth, but a nominal sentence of equation saying the kavod is the fullness of the earth. And we know from biblical texts, like in the Psalms, for instance, that the phrase the fullness of the earth is a way of like talking about kind of all the living things, like the abundance, the living biological abundance of the earth. So there are some readers who see this as actually a statement of the world itself actually being the quote unquote glory of God, right? That is a grammatically feasible reading. And it's interesting to think about perhaps the kind of ecological or environmental potential as of that equation as a preaching strategy. If you ask me, what do I think it means? I don't think it means that. I think it's grammatically possible. I want to be clear about that. It is a just strictly speaking on the way the words fit together, it's possible. I don't think that's what it means. I think in context I think it's the use of a nominal sentence to express a verbal idea, which Hebrew does all the time. And I think it means God's glory fills the whole earth. It fits with what is said a minute ago about the train of the robe filling the whole palace. There is this theme of filling. The echo might bring that out in an auditory way.
It seems like it's saying that however we translate it, the presence, the body, the glory of God is ubiquitous. And in a way, maybe this is being said here because there's no escape from the Lord. There's nowhere you can go where God isn't there.
And fear is another common trope in these prophetic commissioning narratives.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And that's how Isaiah responds when we pick up there in verse 5. Woe is me, I'm lost. Oily. Does that seem to fit pretty well with the pattern of these call narratives to have sort of an initial response of fear like this?
Absolutely. Although, spoiler alert, we're gonna get this twist in a minute where something happens, and we'll talk about what that is, and then suddenly Isaiah is eagerly volunteering for this mission, which is, as I mentioned before, is extremely unusual within this genre. So it's worth unpacking exactly what's going on here. So his response to this visual appearance of the holy, holy, holy deity seems to be one of feeling like he is being put in danger because he is inadequate in light of the holiness of this God versus his own uncleanness.
And particularly lips, right? Sfataim. What's the deal with the lips?
Right. So this is where things get interesting, because what indeed is the deal with the lips? So it's not, I think, woe is me, I am lost, as if he's fearful for his life, but rather, woe is me, for I must be silent. Something like that. That's how I would translate it. Like, oh man, I want to tell people about this, but I can't, right? That's what I think is going on here. Then the rest of the narrative makes a ton of sense, because then the seraph comes and purifies his lips by means of a coal from the altar. And there you have the fire imagery. Mm-hmm. And once his lips are purified, then Isaiah's like, okay, let's do this. I'm ready, right?
I like it. So then there's this sort of, there's a punchline, there's a twist here. And how does that change things?
Yeah, I mean, it totally changes things. Because if you end the lectionary with, here I am, send me, right? That's like a really nice way of like, accepting God's mission for you. But what does that mission actually entail? Isaiah ends up being commanded to essentially be an anti-prophet. If the goal of the prophet is to try to get the people to hear God's message, God tells him, you're going to do whatever you can to prevent this people from hearing my message, right? And we could spend a lot of time unpacking the specific language that's used here. There has been really great scholarship from the perspective of disability studies on the language that is used here in terms of the blindness and deafness imagery. What I really, for time's sake, just want to focus on is that the rationale here that God says is, I want you to prevent the people from actually doing what theoretically you would think I would want them to do, because I don't want them to actually fix themselves. I don't want them to repent. I don't want them to turn back. The idea seems to be that God has basically had enough, that he's fed up, and he is looking for pretense to destroy the people, which is obviously...
That's troubling.
Troubling. Yeah, very troubling.
To put it mildly, you can see why people might want to stop the lectionary before we get there. By the way, Isaiah has a similar reaction when he says, "How long, my Lord?" You can picture him basically basically just jaw on the floor, right? Like, what did I just sign up for? He's like, okay, but when do I stop this? And God's answer is, until there's nothing left, right? Mm-hmm. I see this as basically being Isaiah assuming, I'm going to be commissioned for a prophetic mission of salvation. The tide is going to turn, right? Everything's going to be great. And that's behind him eagerly signing up. And it actually turns out that it's the complete opposite. For me, in terms of tying this into contemporary context, I think this could be a really fruitful preaching angle, although maybe difficult. I see this as a rebuke to those who are eager to be prophets. And going back to what I said in opening in terms of situating my own academic interests, I'm very, very interested in the way that the discourse of prophetic social critique from the Bible is used in contemporary justice work in religious settings. I don't want to give the false impression that I'm opposed to that, but it is striking that nowadays people are very eager to present their work and their voice as being prophetic. Right? I teach this stuff in my classes when we deal with contemporary manifestations of prophecy. There, as I'm sure you know, as I'm sure many of the listeners know, there are entire handbooks of so-called prophetic preaching, right? And it's important to remember that for the most part in the Hebrew Bible, nobody wanted to be a prophet. They ran screaming in the other direction, right? Whereas nowadays, everybody wants to be a prophet. And I see Isaiah 6 as a really important rebuke to that prophetic eagerness that we see today. That actually, being a prophet is not something you should want, because you don't always know what exactly God is up to. You don't know what you're signing up for. And you don't know exactly what role your message is actually intended to play. Now, I'm not, again, I really want to be very careful in emphasizing, I'm not trying to say that people should not use the prophetic text as inspiration for justice work. I'm very committed to that project. But I do think that it is an important corrective to a sense that the accepting the mantle of prophecy is like a straightforward thing. And this text really complicates that, because here you have a prophet stepping forward and being very excited about this prospect, and it ends terribly for everybody involved.
Is this the right time to then kind of move toward preaching pitfalls, since it sounds like we're already kind of edging toward what are some not so useful or bad ways that this text could be used?
Yeah. What are some other sort of dangerous alleys that preachers shouldn't go down?
Well, the one that I was troubled by myself was remnant theology that's there in the holy seed is in its stump, right?
So do you want to talk about verse 13? There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, do you have some thoughts on that, Ethan?
Rosie, I think you have the NRSV in front of you, I think, right? Would you mind just for our listeners, like reading how they translate verse 13, and then I'll come back to the JPS because this is interesting.
Right. So verse 13 in the NRSV reads, "Even if a tenth part remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump."
Great. Now listen carefully to what the JPS does with it again. "But while a tenth part yet remains in it, it shall repent." So in the NRSV, the Hebrew word shuv means to turn back, and it can be used adverbially to mean again. So that's how the NRSV reads it, that this is going to be, it's like if you're pulling up weeds and then you notice you thought you got the whole thing, but there's a little bit of the root left. You go back and you pull it out because you know if you leave that little root, the whole thing's going to come back anyway. That's the metaphor here, but with fire instead of with uprooting. But it's basically God is saying, I'm going to destroy the whole thing. And if it turns out that even a tenth, which is like a biblical way of saying a teeny bit, is left, that fire is going to come back again until the whole thing is destroyed, right? The JPS translation takes the Hebrew word shuv in the more abstract conceptual meaning, which is to repent, to turn back in the sense of turning back to proper conduct, right? In that rendering, this final oracle is actually one of hope amidst destruction. That even though the vast majority of everything will be destroyed, there will be a small subset that will actually do the right thing. It will be a survived remnant, right? What you have here basically is the imagery of the stump functioning in two totally different ways. In the negative NRSV reading, the stump is a symbol of devastation and destruction, right? It's all that's left of this once proud tree. Yeah. In the JPS understanding, the stump is actually a symbol of hope.
There is still
something left. Yeah. And actually we know if you look, this is something that really happens when trees fall down in nature. The stump actually becomes basically, a place that becomes teeming with other kinds of life. Stumps are thriving ecosystems. So which of these is right? Well, I follow a scholarly approach here, which would say actually they're both right. They offer readings from different stages of the history of this text. And again, this is not, I don't want anyone who's listening to think that, this is the absolute 100% objective truth. This is a debate in the literature. So this is my reading of the history of this passage, but there are scholars who disagree. But I follow an approach that basically says that in the original context of Isaiah chapter 6, or what would eventually become what we call Isaiah 6, this was, as the NRSV read it, it was a straightforward oracle of destruction which fits with what comes before it. It fits with the negative stuff that comes before it. And it did not have that final line, the reference to the stump as the holy seed, which is a very messy and kind of iffy line if you look at the ancient manuscripts, that the original version was like the NRSV minus that final line about the holy seed. Even if a tenth part remains in it, it will be burned again until all that's left is a stump. Boom, full stop, end of discussion. Destruction, the people is destroyed, right? What I think and what some other scholars think is that in light of a repentance theology that developed in the post-exilic period, following the return of the people from the Babylonian exile, a later editor went back and added in that final phrase, its stump is the holy seed, or its stump shall be the holy seed, and therefore implicitly reinterpreted the Hebrew word shuv from being an adverbial again to actually referring to repentance, right? There might be some concerns, ethical concerns from a preaching perspective about the so-called remnant theology in terms of what it means about othering people that you disagree with, or implying that the people who are lost in catastrophes somehow deserved it, or that only people who survive are worthy, or something like that. And those are all valid concerns. But I think that there is something that is really promising about if you buy my argument that this was originally a straightforward oracle of doom, that a later editor reimagined in line with the possibility of survival. I think if you sort of take that history, don't take either reading of the verse alone, but take the history of the editing of the verse as kind of a message in and of itself. I think that's a very powerful affirmation of the possibility for going back to texts that might seem straightforwardly negative and condemnatory, and like finding promise and potential in them.
I love that. I not only do I buy your argument, but even if not, one of the few things that I feel like I sort of get about prophetic literature in general is that even when you have very drastic messages of doom, the very fact that they're being reported at all is a glimmer of hope. Even
Absolutely.
The message that says, nothing's going to survive, everybody's going to be wiped out. There's no hope. So, make a change and maybe something will happen. Like there's this sort of invitation of change and of possibility.
I think there's also just a connection to human life and experience. And when we go through really bad things, sometimes we think that's just the end and like that's something's over. But it's often in these stumps, in these places where you've indicated it just feels like there's no life. New life that you could not have imagined, in this stump comes out, so there are points in my own life where I could reflect on things that I thought were ends that turned out to be different beginnings. That might be a preaching angle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's an important practice of figuring out how to tell better stories, better narratives about painful or negative or difficult moments in our past. And like I think that's a big part of growth. And yeah, I think it's incredibly inspiring the possibility that there might have been this scribe who managed to look at this incredibly, grim oracle and actually find a way to reframe it as being at least a little bit to a certain measure. And yeah, I think that, forget about the sort of large national context of this as like referring to this larger people or this covenantal context. I think even, Rosie, as you're saying, on the level of individual life experience, right, that can be a powerful lesson.
Well, we've got a whole lot of great stuff here. That seems like a good spot for us to wrap up our conversation for now. Ethan, it has been such a pleasure to have you back on the podcast, and hopefully we can do a three-peat of this at some point.
Thank you so much to both of you.
All right, friends, that brings us to the end of another episode of First Reading. Don't forget that you can subscribe and follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Amazon, or Facebook, or wherever you get your podfix. You can also access all of our back episodes, get more info about our guests and hosts, and browse the nifty First Reading swag, all over at firstreadingpodcast.com. Thank you to those of you who support our work with donations. If you'd like to make a one-time or recurring monthly donation to help keep this podcast sustainable, that's also available on our website. Thanks also to Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University for a helpful grant in support of our work, and to Pludot Sessions and Tim McNinch for our original music this week. Until next time, I'm Rosie Candlethal.
And I'm Tim McNinch. Thanks for listening.